October 14th, 1889, Salem, Massachusetts. In the fading light of an autumn afternoon, inside a modest Victorian home on Chestnut Street, a photographer named Ezra Whitmore arranged his equipment with unusual care. The family before him sat in their finest clothes, the father's hand resting protectively on his wife's shoulder, while she cradled what appeared to be a sleeping infant. The baby's porcelain skin caught the pale light filtering through lace curtains, creating an almost ethereal glow around the child's peaceful face. What Whitmore didn't know, what none of the townspeople who would later view this portrait could have imagined, was that the infant had been dead for nearly a month. This photograph would become one of the most disturbing images of the Victorian era, not for what it showed, but for what it concealed. At first glance, it appeared to be nothing more than another family portrait, the kind that filled albums across New England during those prosperous decades following the Civil War. But hidden within the sepia tones and careful composition lay a secret so macabre that when the truth finally emerged, it would shatter a community's understanding of grief, love, and the lengths to which parents might go to deny death itself. The baby in the portrait, little Margaret Rose Ashworth, possessed an impossible beauty. Her skin showed no signs of decay, no hint of the pallor that comes with death. Her tiny fingers, curled delicately around a silk ribbon, appeared soft and warm. Her eyes, though closed, seemed to rest beneath lids that might flutter open at any moment. Even her hair, fine as spun gold, seemed to catch light as if it still grew. But according to the death certificate filed with the town clerk on September 18th of that same year, Margaret Rose had succumbed to scarlet fever 26 days before this portrait was taken. The attending physician, Dr. Jonathan Heathcote, had personally signed the document, noting the time of death as 2:30 in the morning. He had seen the child's final breath, had closed her eyes with his own hands. How then could this same child appear so vibrantly alive in a photograph taken nearly a month? Men, veterans of the recent war, who had seen death in all its forms, found themselves unsettled by the image's impossible perfection. Margaret Rose Ashworth had been born on a bitter February morning in 1889, during one of the harshest winters Massachusetts had seen in decades. From her first breath, she had been sickly, too small, too pale, struggling against illnesses that seemed to claim her strength before she could build it. Eleanor Ashworth, herself weakened by a difficult birth, had poured her failing energy into keeping her daughter alive. Thomas, a successful merchant who had built his fortune in the textile trade, spared no expense in bringing specialists from Boston, purchasing exotic medicines, consulting with anyone who claimed knowledge of childhood ailments. But despite their desperate efforts, little Margaret Rose continued to weaken. By September, as the leaves began their descent into autumn's embrace, it became clear that the child would not see another season. Dr. Heathcote made his final visit on the evening of September 17th, shaking his head gravely as he informed the parents that nothing more could be done. The scarlet fever had claimed too much of her strength. It was, he said with the practiced gentleness of a man who had delivered such news countless times, simply a matter of hours. Yet somehow, impossibly, this dying child had been transformed into the serene, perfectly preserved infant, captured in Ezra Whitmore's lens 26 days later. The photograph's existence challenged everything the community thought they understood about death, preservation, and the boundaries between the living and the dead. And as the full scope of the Ashworth family's actions began to emerge, Salem would discover that some boundaries should never be crossed, and some loves are too terrible to comprehend. The Victorian era was a time of profound contradiction, an age of scientific progress shadowed by an almost medieval fascination with death. The recent invention of photography had given birth to an entire industry devoted to capturing final images of the deceased, particularly children, whose mortality rates remained devastating. Subjects to create the illusion of peaceful slumber rather than eternal rest. This practice, born from love and desperation, reflected the era's complex relationship with mortality. Death was ever present in Victorian life, a specter that visited homes regularly, claiming infants with ruthless frequency, striking down breadwinners in their prime, and leaving families shattered by losses that modern medicine would easily prevent. In response, society developed elaborate mourning customs that bordered on obsession. Widows wore black for years, sometimes decades. Locks of hair were preserved in lockets and jewelry. Seances became fashionable entertainment as families sought communication with their departed loved ones. The cult of mourning reached its zenith in the 1880s, fueled by Queen Victoria's own endless grief for her beloved Albert. Mourning photography emerged as the ultimate expression of this cultural fixation, a way to possess the dead, to hold them in permanent stillness, to create a final moment that could be revisited again and again. Studios specialized in these portraits, advertising their services with promises of eternal remembrance and lasting memorials to departed angels. Yet even within this culture of death worship, certain boundaries remained inviolate. Post-mortem photography was meant to capture the peaceful dignity of death, not to deny death's reality. The deceased were meant to appear at rest, not alive, and above all, these portraits were taken immediately after death, within hours of the final breath, when the body still retained some semblance of life's warmth and color. The Ashworth portrait violated every one of these unspoken rules. Memorial photographs typically betrayed subtle signs of their subject's true state, a waxy pallor, the particular stillness that comes only with death, positioning that suggested careful arrangement rather than natural pose. Experienced viewers could distinguish between the living and the dead in family portraits, noting telltale details that marked the boundary between worlds. But Margaret Rose Ashworth displayed none of these characteristics. Her skin retained a healthy pink flush. Her limbs fell naturally, without the rigid positioning common to post-mortem subjects. Most disturbing of all, several witnesses' death. Her positioning suggested natural sleep rather than post-mortem arrangement. Most puzzling of all, the photographic chemistry itself seemed unusual. The image possessed a clarity and luminosity that exceeded even the finest memorial portraits of the era. I have examined over 300 post-mortem photographs in my career, Dr. Hartwell wrote in his report to the Massachusetts Medical Society. In every case, the subject displays unmistakable signs of death's intervention. This child shows none. Either this photograph was taken of a living infant, or preservation techniques have been employed that exceed any known to medical science. The broader photographic community took notice. Experts arrived from New York and Philadelphia to study the image, hoping to understand how such perfect preservation had been achieved. Their conclusions would prove more disturbing than enlightening, raising questions about the methods the Ashworth family had employed to maintain their daughter's lifelike appearance. What had begun as an expression of parental grief was revealing itself as something far more sinister, a denial of death so complete that it challenged the natural order itself. Mrs. Constance Whitwell had been the Ashworths' neighbor for nearly 15 years when she received the invitation that would haunt her remaining days. Written in Eleanor's careful script on cream-colored stationery, the note arrived on an unseasonably warm October afternoon, its words both gracious and deeply unsettling. "Dear Constance," it began, "Thomas and I would be honored if you would join us this evening to view our recent portrait. Little Margaret Rose looks so beautiful in it, and we know you have always taken such interest in our precious daughter. Please come at 7 o'clock. We have much to share with those who truly understand a parent's love." Mrs. Whitwell had known of Margaret Rose's death, of course. The entire street had witnessed Dr. Heathcote's solemn departure on that September morning, had seen the undertaker's cart arrive later that day. She had sent flowers, had paid her respects at what she assumed was the funeral service. The idea that the Ashworths had commissioned a memorial portrait seemed natural enough. Such photographs had become increasingly joy, his eyes bright with an enthusiasm that seemed wildly inappropriate for a man who had recently lost his only child. "Constance, how wonderful that you could come. Eleanor is so excited to show you our beautiful Margaret Rose. She looks absolutely perfect in the portrait, exactly as she did in life, perhaps even more beautiful." He led her through the familiar hallway into the front parlor, where several other neighbors had already gathered. The room buzzed with an electric tension, conversations conducted in hushed, anxious tones. At the center of it all stood Eleanor Ashworth, positioned beside a large framed photograph mounted on an ornate easel. Mrs. Whitwell's first glimpse of the portrait struck her like a physical blow. She had seen memorial photographs before. Her own sister had commissioned one, following the loss of twin boys in 1876. She knew what such images looked like, understood the subtle artistry required to capture death in the guise of peaceful slumber. This was not that. The child in the photograph appeared vibrantly, impossibly alive. Her skin glowed with health, her tiny fingers curled naturally around a silk ribbon, her expression one of serene contentment, rather than the profound stillness of death. Most disturbing of all, her positioning suggested a living infant, merely sleeping, as if she might wake at any moment and turn her gaze toward the viewer. "Isn't she beautiful?" Eleanor whispered, her voice carrying a note of desperate pride. The photographer said he had never captured such a perfect image. "She looks exactly as she did when she was with us. No, even better. Death has only made her more beautiful." Mrs. Whitwell found herself unable to respond. Every instinct screamed that something was fundamentally wrong with the scene before her, yet she couldn't identify exactly what. The child appeared too perfect, too alive for a memorial portrait. But surely her eyes were deceiving her. Surely grief was clouding her judgment. "When was this photograph taken?" she finally managed to ask. Thomas answered with obvious pride. "Just last week. We waited until we could arrange everything perfectly. Margaret Rose needed to look her past the nursery windows in the weeks following the supposed death. Shadows that suggested ongoing activity in a room that should have been empty." Eleanor's responses to these observations grew increasingly agitated. She insisted that their mourning practices were private, that they preferred to grieve without the intrusion of public ceremony. When pressed about the timing of the photograph, she claimed they had needed time to prepare themselves emotionally for such an important memorial. But her explanations satisfied no one. The portrait itself seemed to pulse with an energy that defied rational explanation. Several visitors reported feeling inexplicably cold when standing near it, as if the temperature dropped by degrees in its immediate vicinity. Children who were brought to view the image became visibly distressed, refusing to look directly at it and clinging to their parents with unusual urgency. Most disturbing was the effect the portrait had on Eleanor herself. As she stood beside it throughout the evening, her behavior grew increasingly erratic. She spoke to the photograph as if addressing a living child, adjusting the frame's position with the careful attention of a mother tending to an infant's needs. At one point, Mrs. Whitwell observed Eleanor leaning close to the image and whispering what appeared to be a lullaby, her lips moving in the rhythm of a familiar song. By evening's end, the assembled neighbors departed with a shared sense of unease that would only deepen in the weeks to come. Word of the strange portrait began to spread beyond Chestnut Street, drawing curious visitors from across Salem, and eventually attracting the attention of photographers and medical professionals from Boston. Mrs. Whitwell would later testify that she returned home that night, convinced she had witnessed something profoundly unnatural. In her journal, she wrote, "The Ashworth child appears alive in death, preserved in a state that mocks God's natural order. I fear Eleanor has lost her reason to grief, but I fear even more that something darker is at work in that house. The portrait watches those who view it, and I cannot escape the feeling that little Margaret Rose is somehow still present, trapped within those silver salts and chemicals, neither full." Portable lighting equipment. Dr. Fenimore studied every detail of the child's appearance with the methodical precision that had made him a respected authority in his field. What he discovered defied medical explanation. The infant's skin showed none of the characteristic changes that begin within hours of death. No lividity marked her back or limbs where blood should have settled. No rigor mortis had fixed her features in the rigid mask common to corpses. Most puzzling of all, her coloration remained pink and healthy, not the waxy pallor of death, nor the artificial flush created by cosmetics that Dr. Fenimore could easily detect in other post-mortem photographs. "I have examined the deceased within moments of death and weeks after burial," he wrote in his preliminary report. "This child displays characteristics consistent with life, not death. Either my understanding of human physiology is fundamentally flawed, or preservation methods have been employed that exceed any known to medical science." Dr. Fenimore requested access to the child's body to confirm his visual observations with physical examination. The request triggered the first open crisis in the Ashworth household since the portrait's creation. Eleanor's reaction was immediate and violent. She collapsed to the floor, screaming that no one would touch her daughter, that Margaret Rose was finally at peace and must not be disturbed. Thomas attempted to calm her, but his own demeanor suggested barely controlled panic. They refused to reveal the location of their daughter's burial, claiming privacy rights that, while legally questionable, were difficult for authorities to challenge without stronger evidence of wrongdoing. Frustrated but persistent, Dr. Fenimore expanded his investigation to include the photograph's technical aspects. He interviewed Ezra Whitmore, the photographer who had taken the portrait, hoping to understand the chemical processes that had created such an unusual image. Whitmore's account proved deeply troubling. The photographer admitted that the session had been unlike any in his 20-year career. When he had arrived at the Ashworth home on October 14th, the family had already arranged the scene with meticulous care. Of the stiffness that makes post-mortem photography so technically challenging. Most unsettling was Whitmore's observation about the child's weight. When he had helped position her for the portrait, she seemed unnaturally light, as if something essential had been removed from her small body. He compared the sensation to holding a beautifully crafted doll, rather than human remains. The photographic chemistry itself presented additional mysteries. Whitmore's usual exposure times and chemical processes had produced an image of exceptional clarity and luminosity. The child seemed to glow from within the photograph, as if lit by some internal source, rather than external illumination. Multiple attempts to recreate these effects with other subjects had failed completely. Dr. Fenimore's technical analysis revealed further anomalies. The silver salts that formed the image showed patterns unlike anything in his experience with memorial photography. Under microscopic examination, the child's image appeared to have been burned into the photographic plate with unusual intensity, creating shadows and highlights that seemed to shift depending on viewing angle and lighting conditions. The photographic evidence suggests preservation techniques that maintain not merely the appearance of life, but some essential quality that I cannot scientifically define, Dr. Fenimore reported. The child's image possesses a vitality that exceeds the boundaries of death itself. Meanwhile, other evidence began to surface that painted an increasingly disturbing picture of the weeks between Margaret Rose's death and her portrait session. A private investigation commissioned by town officials uncovered financial records showing that Thomas Ashworth had made significant purchases from apothecaries in Boston and Providence during September and early October. The itemized receipts included exotic oils, preservative compounds, and chemical supplies typically used in embalming, but in quantities far exceeding those needed for standard mortuary practices. More troubling were receipts for substances that had no legitimate use in death preparation. Rare herbs from Africa and South America, mineral compounds associated with alchemical practices, and quantities of mercury, practices that challenged both science and morality. But the truth, as investigators would soon discover, was even more disturbing than these already shocking revelations suggested. On November 2, 1889, Dr. Fenimore submitted his final report to the Massachusetts Medical Society. His conclusions would send shockwaves through the scientific community and forever change Salem's understanding of the events unfolding within the Ashworth home. Based upon my examination of photographic and documentary evidence, he wrote, I must conclude that the child known as Margaret Rose Ashworth has been preserved through methods that exceed any known to legitimate medicine. The techniques employed appear designed not merely to prevent decay, but to maintain the appearance and certain characteristics of life itself. I can offer no scientific explanation for the observed phenomena, and I strongly recommend that civil authorities take immediate action to investigate the circumstances surrounding this child's death and subsequent preservation. The report's release marked the end of the Ashworth family's privacy and the beginning of an investigation that would reveal horrors beyond anything Salem had previously witnessed. As autumn shadows lengthened across Salem, whispers began to echo through the town's narrow streets with increasing urgency. What had started as curiosity about an unusual family portrait was transforming into something far more sinister. A growing suspicion that Thomas and Eleanor Ashworth had transgressed boundaries that should never be crossed. The first substantial breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Abigail Fletcher, a midwife who had attended Margaret Rose's birth, approached town officials with information that cast the entire narrative of the child's life and death in a disturbing new light. According to Mrs. Fletcher's testimony, she had been summoned to the Ashworth home not once, but repeatedly during the months following the baby's supposed death. Each time, Eleanor had claimed to be experiencing complications related to childbirth, requesting treatments for post-delivery ailments that seemed to persist far beyond any normal recovery period. "She would send for me in the dead of night," Mrs. Fletcher testified, claiming she needed attention for nursing difficulties. "She looked like a woman who was pouring her life force into some terrible task," Mrs. Fletcher recalled. "Her eyes held a desperate intensity that I had seen before only in mothers whose children were dying. But her child was already supposed to be dead." The midwife's testimony prompted officials to question other service providers who had visited the Ashworth home during the mysterious weeks between the reported death and the portrait session. Their accounts revealed a pattern of secretive activity that suggested the family was engaged in practices that extended far beyond normal mourning customs. Mr. Jonathan Harville, who delivered ice to homes throughout the neighborhood, reported that the Ashworth household had increased their ice orders dramatically following the child's death. Instead of the typical weekly delivery, they requested daily shipments of unusually large quantities, all to be delivered to a specific entrance that avoided the main parlor where visitors were received. They would accept the ice at the kitchen door and carry it immediately upstairs, Harville testified. "I could hear activity in the rooms above, movement, voices, what sounded like work being done. It was not the silence of a house in mourning." Even more disturbing was the account provided by Father Michael Donnelly, the Catholic priest who had been asked to perform last rites for Margaret Rose. According to his testimony, Thomas Ashworth had approached him in early September, requesting the sacrament for his dying daughter. But when Father Donnelly arrived at the appointed time, he was told the child had suddenly improved and the rites were no longer necessary. "Mr. Ashworth seemed agitated when he turned me away," Father Donnelly reported. "He spoke of having found other means to ensure his daughter's salvation, methods that did not require the intervention of the church. When I pressed him for details, he became evasive, speaking of ancient practices and knowledge that had been lost to modern times." The priest's account was particularly troubling because it suggested the Ashworths had rejected conventional religious comfort in favor of alternatives that official sources were reluctant to detail. References in Thomas's correspondence to preservation arts and binding techniques began to take on more troubling with the exotic substances Thomas had special ordered from suppliers in Boston and New York. Receipts showed purchases of rare oils from Africa, mineral compounds from South America, and plant extracts that contemporary sources could only describe as associated with primitive preservation practices used by cultures that were considered savage by Victorian standards. The accumulating evidence painted a picture of parents who had descended into increasingly desperate measures to deny their daughter's death. But testimony from one final witness would transform suspicion into horrified certainty. Mrs. Catherine Mills, who worked as a seamstress for several wealthy Salem families, had been commissioned by Eleanor Ashworth to create a series of infant gowns during October of 1889. The order itself was unusual. Elaborate christening gowns and burial dresses in sizes that suggested they were meant for a child who was no longer growing. Mrs. Ashworth was very specific about the measurements, Mrs. Mills testified. She provided exact dimensions for a child's body, but insisted that the garments be constructed to accommodate a figure that would not move or breathe. She spoke of needing clothes that would maintain their appearance indefinitely, that would not wrinkle or shift with normal infant movement. When Mrs. Mills delivered the completed garments, she was shocked by what she observed in the Ashworth home. Eleanor led her upstairs to a room that had been converted into something resembling a shrine. The walls were covered with images of Margaret Rose, sketches, paintings, and multiple copies of the recent photograph arranged in elaborate displays. At the center of the room stood a small bed surrounded by flowers that were replaced daily to maintain their freshness. The air was thick with the scent of exotic oils and incense, creating an atmosphere that Mrs. Mills could only describe as otherworldly. Mrs. Ashworth spoke to that empty bed as if a living child lay within it, Mrs. Mills reported. She cooed and whispered, adjusted imaginary blankets, and behaved in every way like a mother tending to her infant. But there was no child by Mrs. Ashworth, but by something else, something that did not want me there. The accumulating testimony created a portrait of a family that had retreated into practices that challenged every assumption about death, grief, and the boundaries between life and the grave. But the most disturbing revelations were yet to come. On November 15, 1889, authorities armed with a court order arrived at the Ashworth home to conduct a thorough investigation. What they discovered in the house on Chestnut Street would haunt Salem for generations and raise questions about the true nature of parental love when it refuses to accept loss. The forced entry into the Ashworth home revealed a household transformed by grief into something that barely resembled a normal family residence. Sheriff William Thornton, leading the official investigation, would later describe the scene as a temple dedicated to the worship of death masquerading as life. The ground floor appeared relatively normal, though neighbors noted that furniture had been rearranged to create clear pathways leading upstairs, as if the family's entire existence had become focused on the upper rooms. The kitchen showed evidence of unusual activity. Exotic spices and oils, chemical apparatus that seemed more suited to a laboratory than a domestic space, and quantities of ice that suggested preservation efforts on a scale far exceeding household needs. But it was the discovery of Eleanor's private study that provided the first concrete evidence of the methods the family had employed to maintain their daughter's impossible preservation. Hidden behind a locked door in the rear of the house, the study contained what can only be described as a library of the macabre. Shelves lined with books on embalming techniques, ancient preservation practices, and what contemporary sources euphemistically termed unnatural arts. Many of the volumes were in foreign languages: Latin texts on medieval preservation, French treatises on mummification, and German works on chemical techniques for maintaining organic matter in lifelike states. More disturbing were Eleanor's personal journals, discovered locked in a wooden chest beneath the study's ancient techniques for maintaining the departed in states that resemble life. The Egyptians knew such arts, as did certain European nobles, who refused to accept death's finality. If love is strong enough, perhaps even death can be denied. The journals revealed that Thomas had contacted practitioners of what they termed preservation arts in Boston, New York, and even Europe. Letters from these individuals, also found in the study, provided detailed instructions for chemical treatments, ritual practices, and methods of maintaining human remains in conditions that would prevent decay, while preserving the appearance of life. September 28th, Eleanor wrote, "The gentleman from Boston has provided us with oils and compounds that he claims will maintain Margaret Rose's beautiful appearance indefinitely. He speaks of binding techniques that keep the departed present in our world, preventing their spirits from departing while their bodies remain perfect and unchanged." The journal entries became increasingly frantic as Eleanor detailed her daily efforts to preserve her daughter. References to binding oils, spirit anchors, and preservation rituals filled page after page, creating a record of practices that authorities were reluctant to detail in their official reports. October 5th. The treatments are working beautifully. Margaret Rose looks exactly as she did in life, perhaps even more perfect. Her skin remains soft and warm to the touch. Her hair continues to shine with golden light. We have succeeded in keeping death at bay. But the most chilling discovery awaited investigators in the home's upper rooms. The nursery had been converted into what could only be described as a preservation chamber. The walls were lined with chemical apparatus, bottles of exotic oils, and equipment for maintaining precise temperature and humidity conditions. The air was thick with the scent of preservatives and something else, a sweet, cloying odor that investigators struggled to identify. At the center of the room stood an elaborate cradle, surrounded by flowers that were replaced daily to maintain their freshness. The cradle itself had been modified with hidden compartments, containing ice and chemical compounds designed to maintain optimal preservation conditions. Tubes and apparatus connected to the cradle, the dead. The mystery deepened when investigators discovered a hidden chamber beneath the house's main stairs. Accessed through a concealed door in the pantry, this underground room contained the most disturbing evidence yet uncovered. The chamber had been converted into what appeared to be a ritual space. The walls were covered with symbols that local religious authorities refused to interpret publicly. Candles arranged in specific patterns had been burned repeatedly, leaving wax formations that suggested regular ceremonial use. At the center of the room stood an altar-like structure surrounded by the same exotic oils and preservative compounds found throughout the house. Most chilling was the discovery of additional journals hidden within this secret chamber. These documents, written in both Eleanor's and Thomas's handwriting, detailed practices that investigators could only describe as attempts to bind their daughter's spirit to the physical world, while maintaining her body in a state that mocked the natural order of death. October 10th, Thomas had written, "The binding rituals grow stronger each night. Margaret Rose responds to our calls, her presence felt even when her physical form rests in preservation. She has not left us, merely transformed into something beyond the limitations of ordinary life and death." Eleanor's corresponding entries revealed a woman who had lost all connection to reality, who believed her daughter existed in a state that was neither fully alive nor completely dead. "She speaks to me in dreams," Eleanor wrote. "My beautiful Margaret Rose shows me that love can conquer even death itself. We have succeeded in keeping her with us, bound to this world by bonds stronger than death itself. The final entries in these hidden journals were the most disturbing of all. They described nightly rituals in which Thomas and Eleanor would descend to the underground chamber, light candles in specific patterns, and perform ceremonies they believed would strengthen their daughter's connection to the living world. These rituals allegedly involved the use of Margaret Rose's preserved remains, though investigators never found any trace of the child's body. October 13th, Eleanor's final entry read, "Tomorrow we will capture Margaret Rose's perfect beauty in the photograph. She will be with us forever, her image holding her spirit in our world," where the Ashworth family might have concealed their daughter's remains. Medical experts examined soil samples for traces of the exotic preservatives mentioned in the journals. Church authorities checked their records for any evidence of secret burials or irregular funeral practices. Still, nothing. It was as if Margaret Rose Ashworth had been erased from physical existence, while somehow remaining present in the world of the living. The only concrete evidence of her continued existence was the photograph itself, that impossibly perfect image that continued to fascinate and terrify everyone who viewed it. Dr. Fenimore, called back to Salem to examine the newly discovered evidence, concluded his supplementary report with words that would echo through the town for decades. Based upon the physical evidence and documentation discovered in the Ashworth residence, I must conclude that practices were employed that exceed any known preservation techniques. The missing remains suggest either disposal methods of extraordinary sophistication or preservation techniques that have successfully concealed the child's physical form, while maintaining her image in photographic permanence. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the investigation was the discovery that the Ashworths had not acted alone. Among the correspondence found in Eleanor's study were letters from at least 6 other families in New England, who had apparently attempted similar preservation techniques with their own deceased children. These families, connected through a network of practitioners who offered alternatives to traditional mourning, had shared information about chemical compounds, ritual practices, and methods for maintaining the dead in states that resembled life. The letters revealed an underground community of parents so consumed by grief that they had abandoned conventional religion and science in favor of practices that promised to reunite them with their lost children. References to successful bindings and eternal preservations suggested that the Ashworth case was not unique, but part of a broader phenomenon that authorities were only beginning to understand. "We have succeeded where others have failed," wrote one correspondent from Providence. "Our little William appears in our dreams each night, and we have captured appears to have been part of a larger movement of individuals who have rejected conventional approaches to death and grief in favor of practices that I can only describe as an affront to both divine and natural law," he wrote. The investigation's most troubling conclusion was that such practices appeared to be spreading. Other cases began to surface across New England. Families who had commissioned unusual photographs of deceased children. Parents who had made mysterious purchases from apothecaries. Households where neighbors reported strange activities following the deaths of young family members. The Ashworth portrait had revealed not just one family's descent into madness, but evidence of a phenomenon that threatened the very foundations of how civilized society processed death and loss. On November 22, 1889, barely a week after the discovery of the preservation chamber beneath their home, Thomas and Eleanor Ashworth vanished from Salem, as completely as their daughter's remains had disappeared from the physical world. Neighbors reported seeing unusual activity at the house during the early morning hours. Lights moving through rooms that had been dark since the investigation began. The sound of heavy objects being moved, and what appeared to be preparations for immediate departure. By dawn, the house stood empty, its windows dark, its inhabitants gone without trace or explanation. Sheriff Thornton's investigation revealed that the Ashworths had liquidated their financial holdings with remarkable speed and efficiency. Bank records showed that Thomas had withdrawn the family's entire savings in gold coin during the previous week, converted all investments to portable assets, and closed accounts that had been maintained for over a decade. The transactions were conducted through intermediaries, suggesting advanced planning and possibly assistance from the same network of practitioners who had advised them on preservation techniques. More disturbing was evidence that their departure had been coordinated with other families in the underground network that investigators had discovered. On the same day the Ashworths disappeared from Salem, similar families in Providence, Hartford, and Boston also abandoned their homes, leaving behind only empty houses and traces that gas and electricity had been disconnected. Others claimed to hear the sound of infant crying emanating from the upper floors, particularly during storms or periods of unusual darkness. Most disturbing were reports from children who claimed to see a small figure moving past the nursery windows, a pale child who appeared to watch the street below with unblinking attention. Adults dismissed these sightings as imagination or the effect of shadows and reflected light, but the reports were consistent enough to discourage families from allowing their children to play near the abandoned property. The photograph itself presented its own mystery. Following the Ashworths' departure, Ezra Whitmore discovered that the original photographic plates had vanished from his studio. The family had apparently reclaimed not only the finished portrait, but all the technical materials used in its creation. This meant that no independent copies existed for continued study, leaving investigators with only witness testimony and written reports to document their findings. However, rumors began to circulate that copies of the photograph had appeared in private collections across New England. Collectors of unusual images reported acquiring portraits of children who bore remarkable resemblances to Margaret Rose Ashworth, though the sellers claimed these were entirely different families and subjects. The similarities were so striking that experts suspected the same photographic techniques had been employed, suggesting that the Ashworth case was indeed part of a broader phenomenon. Dr. Fenimore, in his final report on the matter, expressed frustration at the vanishing of physical evidence. Without access to the original photograph or the subjects themselves, we are left with testimonial evidence of practices that challenge our understanding of death, preservation, and the boundaries between the living and the dead. The systematic removal of evidence suggests coordination and advanced planning that indicates this was not isolated madness, but organized activity. The medical community's interest in the case gradually faded as other pressing matters demanded attention. But the implications of what had been discovered in Salem continued to trouble those who had witnessed the investigation firsthand. Questions about the nature of consciousness, the possible divine will, and the natural progression from life through death to eternal rest. The possibility that human will can override God's plan for departed souls raises questions that I lack the theological knowledge to address. The Protestant ministers who served Salem's other congregations were equally troubled. Reverend Samuel Morrison, who had officiated at numerous child funerals during his 30-year ministry, found himself questioning assumptions about death and mourning that had seemed absolute. "We tell grieving parents that their children have gone to a better place, that death is part of God's plan," he reflected. But what if love can indeed transcend death? What if parents possess the power to keep their children present in this world? The implications challenge everything we teach about acceptance, faith, and divine will. The broader community's response to the Ashworth revelations reflected deep ambivalence about the boundaries between appropriate mourning and unnatural intervention. While most residents expressed horror at the practices that had been uncovered, some quietly admitted to understanding the desperation that had driven Thomas and Eleanor to such extremes. Mrs. Constance Whitwell, whose initial viewing of the portrait had begun the investigation, struggled with conflicting emotions about what her neighbors had attempted. "As a mother who has lost children of my own, I understand the agony that would drive parents to any extreme," she confided to friends. "But there must be limits to how far love can go in defying God's will." The Ashworths crossed boundaries that should never be crossed. By winter's end, the intensity of community interest in the Ashworth case had begun to fade, replaced by other concerns and newer scandals. But the questions raised by their attempts to preserve their daughter in defiance of death continued to resonate through Salem's collective consciousness, creating an undercurrent of unease that would persist for generations. The house on Chestnut Street remained empty, its windows dark, its rooms silent. But those who passed by during the long winter nights sometimes paused, listening for sounds that reason told them could not exist, watching for lights that had no source, and wondered until historians rediscovered them decades later. Sheriff Thornton moved to California shortly after completing his final report, claiming that he needed distance from memories that interfered with his sleep. Dr. Fenimore published no further papers on post-mortem photography, dedicating his remaining career to less controversial aspects of medical practice. But the story of Margaret Rose Ashworth and her impossible preservation refused to disappear entirely. In the years that followed, similar cases began to surface across New England and beyond. Families who commissioned unusual photographs of deceased children, parents who made mysterious purchases from apothecaries specializing in exotic compounds, households where neighbors reported strange activities following the deaths of young family members. By the dawn of the 20th century, what investigators had initially considered an isolated case of grief-induced madness was revealed as part of a broader phenomenon that challenged society's most fundamental assumptions about death, love, and the boundaries between the living and the dead. The techniques pioneered by practitioners like those who had advised the Ashworth family appeared to have spread through underground networks that connected grieving parents across vast distances. Collectors of unusual photographs reported acquiring images of children whose preservation seemed to exceed any known mortuary techniques. Medical professionals encountered cases where deceased infants appeared to have been maintained in states that defied conventional understanding of decay and decomposition. Religious authorities struggled with theological questions about practices that seemed designed to prevent souls from departing the physical world. The legacy of the Ashworth case extended far beyond Salem's borders, creating ripples that would continue to spread through American society as the new century began. What had started as one family's desperate attempt to deny their daughter's death had revealed the existence of a shadow world where love and science, grief and obsession had combined to challenge the very nature of mortality itself. In the decades that followed, as photography became more sophisticated and mortuary science advanced, growing evidence that such practices had not disappeared with the Ashworths' flight from Salem. Reports continued to surface of families who had achieved similar preservation of deceased children, of photographs that seemed to pulse with impossible life, of techniques that promised to reunite parents with lost children through methods that science could not explain and religion could not accept. The network of practitioners who had advised families like the Ashworths appeared to have evolved and adapted, moving deeper underground while continuing to offer their services to parents desperate enough to challenge death itself. Letters intercepted by authorities in various cities contained references to eternal preservation, binding techniques, and photographic capture that echoed the language found in Eleanor Ashworth's hidden journals. By 1910, 21 years after Margaret Rose Ashworth's impossible portrait was first displayed in her family's Salem parlor, investigators had documented over 30 similar cases across the United States and Europe. Each involved families who had lost young children. Each included unusual photographic sessions conducted weeks or months after death, and each left behind evidence of preservation techniques that exceeded contemporary mortuary science. The phenomenon had become what modern researchers would recognize as a social contagion, a practice that spread through networks of desperate individuals who shared information, techniques, and resources in pursuit of goals that conventional society considered impossible or immoral. The Ashworth case, rather than representing isolated madness, had been an early manifestation of something far larger and more enduring. Yet for all the documentation and investigation that followed, certain questions remained forever unanswered. The location of Margaret Rose Ashworth's physical remains was never determined. The exact nature of the preservation techniques employed by her parents was never fully understood. Most troubling of all, the ultimate fate of the families who had disappeared from Salem and other cities was never discovered. They had vanished as completely as Margaret Rose herself, leaving behind only empty houses, sealed records, and memories that time could not. States that resembled life, the capture of essence in permanent images, the binding of souls to physical objects, had become topics of serious scientific inquiry. The boundary between life and death, once considered absolute, was revealed as far more fluid and permeable than Victorian society had believed. The portrait of Margaret Rose Ashworth, with its impossible perfection and disturbing vitality, had been a harbinger of questions that would continue to challenge human understanding for generations to come. In trying to keep their daughter present in the world of the living, Thomas and Eleanor Ashworth had discovered truths about the nature of existence that society was not yet ready to confront. And somewhere, in private collections or hidden archives, the image itself may still exist, a testament to the power of love to transcend death and a warning about the terrible consequences of refusing to accept loss. Those few who have claimed to see copies of the original portrait in recent decades report the same unsettling sensation that troubled Salem residents over a century ago. The feeling that the child in the photograph is somehow still present, still watching, still waiting for reunion with parents who loved her beyond the boundaries of reason and mortality. The story of Margaret Rose Ashworth serves as both historical curiosity and eternal warning. It reminds us that love, when freed from the constraints of acceptance and reason, can become a force that challenges the very foundations of existence. It suggests that the boundaries between life and death, between presence and absence, between memory and reality, may be far more permeable than we dare to believe, and it raises the most haunting question of all. If one family in 1889 could successfully preserve their child in defiance of death itself, how many other stories of impossible preservation remain hidden in our history, waiting to be discovered by those brave enough to look beyond the comfortable certainties of mortality into the darker truths about love, loss, and the human refusal to accept the finality of death. In the shadows of history, in the forgotten corners of archives and private collections, the image of Margaret Rose Ashworth may still exist, a testament to the